welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Stockport. On tonight's panel, Lucy Fraser, the UK Government's Financial Secretary to the Treasury since the September reshuffle, previously Justice Minister. Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Bridget Phillipson. Sir Howard Davies, Chairman of the NatWest Banking Group, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England and former Director of the London School of Economics. Dr Miatta Fahnbulleh, Economist and Chief Executive of the left-leaning New Economics Foundation. And an entrepreneur who left school at 16, spent 3 decades in banking before starting her own company, now perhaps best known as a former dragon on BBC One's Dragon's Den, Jenny Campbell. Welcome to my panel, welcome to our audience here in Stockport. Very good to see you, and of course, welcome to you at home as well. And do join in the conversation in the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time, and we'll hear what you've got to say on tonight's topics. Our first question tonight is from Sadaf Khan.
Has the budget done enough to counter the rising cost of living for working families?
Bridget.
In a word, no. We think it should have been a budget that did provide that support to families right now who are really facing the pinch. I think we all of us see when we go shopping that everything's more expensive. The cost of filling up your car is a lot more expensive, and all of those gas and electricity bills are arriving, and it's a real pressure on families. That's why we were saying from the Labour Party that we should have cut VAT on gas and electricity bills to 0 for 6 months to give families that real relief I think that they need right now. I think in the longer term, what we also needed to see from the budget was a plan for growth in our economy. So to really get our economy going, we haven't seen that in recent years. And if you look at the forecasts that have come out of the budget, by the end of the Parliament, growth is still going to be incredibly weak. And that means that we'll have less to spend on our public services and less to offer in terms of the support that we can give to working people. I think there are a range of other measures that the government could have brought forward.
But you must welcome things like the increase in the national living wage, for example, to £9.50. Labour was suggesting £10. It's pretty much there. You must be very happy with that.
I want to see a high-wage, high-skill economy. We would have said £10 an hour. We also wouldn't have cut universal credit in the way that the government has done, which has really caused a lot of problems for families going into the winter. That £20 a week cut is the difference for a lot of families between being able to put food on the table, being able to buy good winter clothes for your children. It's getting colder and children grow pretty fast and need that. The change that the government have made on the taper rate so working people can keep more of what they earn, I agree with that. I think the difficulty with that is that only a third of people who lost out through that big cut to universal credit will see any benefit from that change in the taper rate. Okay. I think we do need to do a lot more to make work pay.
Jenny.
Well, I think, for me, this was a very upbeat, bountiful and optimistic budget. We have to start somewhere post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic. So we have to start somewhere. And clearly, the Chancellor, with a reasonably large pot of money, has had to decide where that goes. And I think the question was, has it helped towards the rising cost of living? There has been things in there, such as the tapering of removing universal credit for working families. There has been an uplift in the minimum wage as well. People will always want more, but I personally think that this has been a really good start to get our economy kick-started and to focus the monies where they need to be. And with my business hat on, I applaud the reduction in business rates from April. That will help get the businesses going even faster. We have come out of the economy, out of the crisis even stronger in our economy than we could have hoped. And so I think it is about building back and investing to build back. And do I think, as a family, and I've been there myself, coping with rising cost of living and limited income, we might still have to tighten our belts for a while? Yes, I do. Are we surprised about that? No. So I think it was a good start.
Howard, has the budget done enough to counter the rising cost of living for working families?
Yes. I think it depends on which working families you're talking about. If you look at the total impact of all the budget changes, that's including the income tax changes effectively because allowances have been frozen, as you all know, and plus the changes in the minimum wage and the taper on universal credit. If you look at it all together and the impact of things like the alcohol duties, etc., the bottom 30% of the income distribution does benefit, not hugely, but they do a bit from this budget. The remaining 70%, so from about 30% from the bottom up to the top, all actually do lose. Mainly, the biggest impact is because the normal tax allowance that goes up with inflation is not going to go up with inflation. So you will be paying more. It's called fiscal drag, which is not a pleasant phrase, but it's if you keep the tax rates the same and inflation goes up, then you end up paying more. So the answer is, for the very bottom, it's done something, and for the rest, it's not done anything. Indeed, it's made life worse. There's also the problem that things like the minimum wage going up, which I don't oppose at all, but it does actually probably have an impact on inflation as well, because other wages go up as well, because people maintain differentials and unions then bargain on top of that. So the chances are this is an inflationary budget. So then the big question is, if you want to look at the total impact, what are the consequences for interest rates? Because you may then find that as a result of the budget, the Bank of England puts up interest rates a bit earlier and a bit more than they otherwise would have done to offset the inflationary impact of the budget. So, sorry, that's a long way of saying it's quite difficult to answer your question definitively because we don't know what happens to the interest rates, but probably it's helped the bottom a bit and clobbered the top.
All right. So, Daphne, you asked this question. What's your view?
Well, I just think, like today, for example, there was the announcement around, and sorry, not the announcement, but a leading think tank said middle-income earners, for example, will be £3,000 worse off next year. So clearly, it hasn't helped that particular section. So, yeah, in my view, it probably hasn't.
Okay, and the man in front, yes.
I'm one of the 70% who will definitely be worse off for myself and for my family. When you look at the tax rises, when you look at the inflation, and not to mention the energy costs, I mean, to be fair to Labour, to say that they shouldn't have put a 5% VAT on electricity and gas and all of that, I think was the right decision. I think that Rishi has definitely missed out on doing something that would help the general public.
So not removing that rather than imposing it, not removing it, that's what you're criticising.
Correct, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Okay, and what about the man here in the check shirt?
I'm also one of the 70%. I didn't see much that benefited me in terms of the budget announced yesterday. I agree with the comments from the man on the panel there that maybe the lower end it might have affected, but the middle income earners significantly worse off. I've heard comments from Labour on the panel to say we want high skill, high wage economy, but that seems to conflict with couple of years prior of having uncontrolled labour coming through from Europe, which achieves the complete opposite. So it's a little bit conflicting with what I've heard from the Labour point of view.
Okay. Miatta?
Well, look, I think against the backdrop of a decade, by the way, in which living standards haven't budged, we've got about, we're predicting that there'll be about 23 million people in this country that aren't earning an income that allows them to afford the basics for a decent quality of life. We know that the cost of living crisis is biting really hard. I don't think the Chancellor did enough, quite frankly. Yes, we saw the increase in the national living wage, but the whole idea of a living wage is that you're supposed to be paid a wage that reflects the true cost of living, and £9.50 an hour doesn't. So it doesn't help there. There were measures that tried to help those on low income, but the analysis that has been done suggests that because the government chose, and it was a political choice, let's not forget, to cut universal credit by £20, actually 3/4 of the people on universal credit are going to lose more from that cut than they're going to gain from the measures in the budget. And for me, the real sting in the tail is that there are 3 million people not in work. A lot of, that's not their fault, they're not in work. And in that budget, the government chose to do nothing. And the thing I'm struggling with is why cut the tax on bankers that cost £4 billion and then leave 3 million people to languish? So, the Chancellor was upbeat. I love optimism. I'm an optimist, but it can't be based on hot air. And I think for a lot of people, that optimism will feel incredibly out of touch.
There seemed to be a budget of tax rises for the average person, The Chancellor actually said that the pandemic's the greatest thing to hit the economy in the last 300 years. But the Office of Budget Responsibilities has come out and said that the effects of Brexit long-term are going to be double the pandemic. So is this just the start of our tax rises to pay for Brexit?
What's your response to that, Lucy?
Well, can I answer the original question that Sadaf asked, because it's a very important question. And the budget does a significant amount to help those on lower incomes. You've talked about many of them. There's the national living wage, which is going to come in April, the 6% increase, which will increase for those people who are on it by £1,000 a year. There's the cut in the taper rate for universal credit, and that's going to come in 4 weeks' time. And what we estimate is for 2 million people, that's going to be an increase of on average £1,000 as well a year. Some get more, some get less. What we haven't talked about this evening yet is a host of other measures some are already in place to help those on the lowest
But
incomes.
what about talking about what we have talked about? So you've got Howard here saying about 70% of people are going to be worse off. What about that?
So on Howard's point, our analysis is that those on the lowest incomes will be £1,000 better off, but on average, everyone will be better off by £500. And I'll answer the point that Sadaf made.
Everyone's going to be better off
So
by
on
£500.
average, there will be, for those on middle incomes, people will be on average better, yes, by £500. That is the
I haven't seen that
analysis.
anywhere. I mean, in all the analysis I've seen in the papers today, and that's a very interesting figure. Everyone is going to be £500 better off.
Everyone on average, £500 better.
So you're shaking your head.
The Office of Budget Responsibility doesn't say that in its figures. The Institute for Fiscal Studies doesn't say that in its figures. The Resolution Foundation doesn't say that in its figures. They're all very consistent that living standards are going to get worse. So this budget does not do that. You can always fiddle with figures to try and get you to where you want to, but when you have all the experts saying one thing, I don't know, I'll go with the experts.
So the budget puts in place a large number of measures that is going to help everyone. So we've got £150 billion invested in public services. So that will be increases in the core budgets for education. It's to build 40 hospitals, as well as investments in relation to hubs which will be doing diagnostic care. So 20,000 extra police officers.
Okay, and
so
what about the woman's point
public
here, Lucy, about
services
which again has been pointed out by the Office of Budget Responsibility, that Brexit will leave the economy 4% smaller, which is twice the impact of the pandemic?
Brexit, there was a recognition when we left the EU that there was going to be an impact in relation to Brexit. But what the Chancellor has done in this budget is try to also take the advantages of leaving the EU. So he's brought in place a number of measures, one of which is in relation to tonnage. So the tonnage tax, we've now enabled British ships we've taken away a tax which was preferential to the EU. Another measure that we've managed to put in place is you could get an R&D investment if you're a British company, but you were investing overseas. So we weren't, as a British taxpayer, benefiting from any of that relief that was being granted. £20 billion was paid out to people with no benefit to the UK. So there are measures that we can bring in place now as a result of leaving the EU, which the Chancellor has started upon. And we're going to be doing an overall review of what measures we can bring in that will benefit the British people.
And Howard, as far as, just because I'm mindful you asked this question, as far as the impact of Brexit on the economy versus COVID,
yeah, well,
you're in agreement with the Office of Budget Responsibility?
It looks grim and it's getting worse because what is happening is that the trade performance of the country is deteriorating sharply. It looks as if both exports and imports will be about 15% lower than they were in 2019 by the end of this year. And we all know that trade is a good way to increase productivity. We all benefit, you know, theory of comparative advantage. It's better if I do what I'm good at and I trade with you and you do what you're good at. And this is positive for the economy, positive productivity. And that's not happening. And you can see that in the quite sharp falls in both exports and imports. So this is a difficult background against which to run the British economy. But I do think it's important that we recognise that that's happening, because if you don't acknowledge it, and at the moment the government doesn't really acknowledge it, then you can't begin to sort of correct it. You're not necessarily doing the things that you need to the economy to cope with it. I'm not saying you roll back the clock. We can't. We've made that decision. We've got to live with it. But you won't live with it successfully unless you acknowledge that it's happening and try to deal with it.
Okay.
Thank you. I was put to the challenge.
Briefly,
so we do acknowledge the
briefly.
importance of international trade, and that's why the International Trade Secretary, who was Liz Truss and is now Anne-Marie Trevelyan, has been going around the world making trade deals, 60 trade deals, and negotiations at the moment with New Zealand, with Australia, and with India. So though we are absolutely committed to increasing our trade internationally as we have come out of the EU.
Okay, there's quite a few hands up. I'm going to get through a few more questions if that's all right. But before I do, I want to tell you that next week we will be in Eastleigh, where we'll be joined by the former Unilever Boston environmental campaigner Paul Polman, plus Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, and then the following week we are in Hartlepool. That is, of course, as COP26 draws to a close. We will have the Canadian filmmaker and social activist Naomi Klein on the panel. No doubt she'll be giving us her views on what has and has not been agreed, what progress hasn't been made. Do come and be part of the audience in Eastleigh. That's next week, or Hartlepool the week after. We would love to have you there, and go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there and it will tell you how to do that. So do come and be a part of the programme. Okay, let's move on. We've got lots of questions to get through. I'd like to take another question from another Fiona, actually, Fiona Stevenson.
What message does lifting air passenger duty for domestic flights send to other countries ahead of COP26?
Now, I'm interested that that question gets a round of applause, because that doesn't happen with every question we get. Miatta.
I think it sends a woeful message. And for me, the thing that really sticks is that it's not just the fact that the cut in air passenger duty was announced, but the Chancellor did not mention the word climate in his entire speech. Absolutely breathtaking in the week before COP. And, you know, to be fair to the government, it published its net zero strategy, and there were some good things in there. There were some things that surprised me. They have made some commitments that are important. But I come back to the fact that the net zero strategy is not worth the paper it is written on unless it's backed up by investment. You know, we think that you need to be investing about 30 billion a year in green investment, in green technology, in order to aid the net zero transition, and do it in a way that's just. At the moment, the government is committing about 7.5 billion, which is woefully inadequate. I don't know why he didn't use the headroom that he had in order to invest now in the climate transition. It has to happen. The cost of not doing it in terms of lives, but also in terms of money when we panic to respond, far outweighs the cost of investing to do this thing properly. And I think if we want COP to be a success, the UK government needs to show leadership. And part of the reason we need to show leadership is because of our historical obligation. You know, the Industrial Revolution started here. I think we have a duty to lead the transition that needs to happen. And I think when the government is speaking with one hand, but, you know, acting in a different way, it undermines our capacity to lead others towards the sort of agreement that we desperately need them to come to at the Climate Summit.
Bridget.
Yeah. I mean, I think it sends completely the wrong message, you know, in the days running up to COP26, which I think is an incredible opportunity for our country to show global leadership on this big challenge that we face of climate change. I mean, there's a need to tackle it. Of course there is. There's a moral imperative around climate change. But I think it's also a brilliant opportunity to create lots of really well-paid, highly skilled jobs in every corner of our country. You know, I said earlier that I wanted to see more growth in the economy. Absolutely. So let's create those jobs that will give us the growth that we need, well-paid, secure jobs. I mean, that's why Labour's said that we think it's really important that we make that investment for the long run. So we've got a commitment around a climate investment pledge to get us to that position. But it would also allow us to do lots of those measures that I think would provide real help to families. And if we better insulate our homes, if we make them more energy efficient, that'll make heating your home a lot cheaper for families too. So I think it has benefits for all of us. I mean, I do just think it is extraordinary that the Chancellor cut air passenger duty on those short-haul flights, isn't providing the same level of investment that we need to see, particularly in high-speed rail, and also spent an awful long time talking about alcohol duty, an awful long time. And then on climate, barely a word. I mean, I just think it is completely the wrong set of priorities and sends the wrong message at a really crucial moment for our country.
OK, the man in the pink shirt.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned the Brexit issue, we've mentioned the pandemic. Global warming is the biggest issue that's facing the human race. You know, domestic flights, the maths hasn't been done. They are the worst polluters. If you look at it per CO2 per passenger, they are one of the worst polluters. Rishi's got his maths wrong.
OK. The man in the blue shirt, the blue jacket. Yes, you, sir.
In April this year, France decided it was going to stop all domestic flights. Why couldn't we do the same?
So what France has done is basically, if it would be amount to a train journey longer than 2.5 hours, the legislation is going through at the moment, you can take a flight. But otherwise, they are introducing legislation to ban that. Yes, and the man at the back there in the blue T-shirt.
I completely agree. I feel that in addition to what a poor sort of symbol it is, only a few days before COP26, after a pandemic that's disproportionately affected people in lower income brackets, to make something cheaper for what I would assume the majority of people who take domestic transport, to make it cheaper, domestic flights, sorry, to make it cheaper for them, doesn't really, I can't see any justification for it at all, really.
So, Lucy, we had a look at this, and on the, if you're going up to Glasgow on the weekend of COP26, for example, a train to Glasgow from London costs £107. A flight from Gatwick, leaving within about 20 minutes, costs £37. You happy with that?
I think we need to identify what this measure was doing. And what this measure was doing, the gentleman said, I don't see any point for it. And the measure was about levelling up. It was about connectivity. It was about ensuring that we can travel across all regions in the UK as easily as possible. And what we haven't mentioned so far is at the same time as the Chancellor cut domestic duty, he increased long-haul duty at the same time. When we're talking about climate change overall, this was a small measure. It will affect about under 1% of our UK carbon emissions. But if we take a step back, what has the government done in relation to climate change? And since 2010, we've cut our carbon emissions by 44%. We were the first country to identify that we should have a net zero target by 2050. When we took the leadership of COP, only 30% of countries had a similar commitment.
Lucy, the question is what message does lifting... But the question is what message does lifting air passenger duty for domestic flights send to other countries ahead of COP26? What message do you think it sends?
I think that the government has done a significant amount in relation to climate change. As we've discussed it.
But what message do you think that is the question? I hate to keep dragging you back to it.
The message, well, we've done two measures in relation to air passenger duty, one of which was to decrease it and one of which was to increase it. And what that measure was about was not about climate change, it was about ensuring that we were levelling up. And we've got a large number of measures. We're spending £30 billion.
So it was nothing to do with climate change. So adding extra duty onto long-haul flights was nothing to do with climate change. Yeah, that's what you just said, I think. It's about levelling up.
The measure, the reason that we took the decision, the reason the Chancellor made the decision to cut domestic rates on air passenger duty was in relation to our levelling up agenda.
Okay.
But Lucy, it is to do with climate change because it has an impact on carbon emissions. So you can't make these decisions in isolation. It's not good enough to say, oh, by the way, the Chancellor just wasn't thinking about climate when he made this decision because it has an impact on climate.
Okay, let me bring Jenny in.
Yeah. So I think it was the most peculiar part of the budget that I thought the same as you. Where did that come from and why? So I've spent some time today trying to rationalise it in my own mind and how it interweaves with climate change as well. I mean, it does seem perhaps poor timing with what's coming in Glasgow. And the only way I rationalised it is the benefit to the UK airlines is all about bringing our economy up and our industries back who have been, the airlines have been in dire straits since last April. So it gives them a boost, which boosts the economy, which boosts employment, etc., etc. And the budget, this is one budget in a whole sequence of budgets. And you can't do everything for climate, economy, social. You can't do everything in one budget, so you have to make some choices. And I think the choices in this budget, although I don't think timing was great with this particular measure with COP, I just think that this budget is all about economy first, getting jobs back, getting wealth back in the country, and from that more steps will be made. And Lucy is right, you know, I haven't been an avid follower of all things climate over the last 10 years, but certainly in recent years I've woken up to it. I'm probably being a sceptic to the scientists and the politicians, but I do listen to David Attenborough, and we do need to do more. And Britain has done a lot in the last few years, more than other countries. So some things have to wait, unfortunately, and that is down to, you know, certain sectors of our communities and certain industries, and certain, you know, challenges like climate have to wait till we've made first base in our economy.
Okay.
I mean, if the idea is really about levelling up, does that mean we're trying to raise the level of pollutants that come about from domestic air travel?
And the man in the mustard sweater there, yeah.
Although a noble initiative, is COP26 not a wasted opportunity if bigger, larger economies such as Russia, China, don't take their emissions seriously?
Or may not even come, in fact. And the man in the back in the white top there, yeah.
I struggled a bit with getting my head around this particular policy. And the more I thought about it, I was wondering whether you could look at it and say, with the year we've had being unable to go abroad as such, there was a lot of emphasis on staycations. Could this sort of stimulate that kind of thing from a countrywide point of view? Staying at home, travelling around the UK and stimulating our own economy that way, perhaps?
Yeah, it's coming in April 2023, so there'll be a bit of time before that might happen. I mean, Howard, I was going to ask you, you're presumably one of the bankers that the Shadow Chancellor referred to, sitting on planes sipping champagne. You must be quite chuffed with it.
Not at all. Not at all. A few years back, David Cameron asked me to chair a commission into airports policy, which was a hospital pass, if ever there was one. And I went round the country visiting all the airports, and I was in receipt, as they say, of this lobbying from airports here in favour of getting rid of airline passenger duty on domestic flights and other flights as well. And my commission looked into this in some detail. The problem with aviation that you've got is that aviation does not pay VAT on fuel. Or internationally, you can never reach an agreement on it. And the incidence of air passenger duty actually effectively replicates VAT. I mean, it's a different way of getting there, but it levels up, to use a popular phrase, the taxation of different types of transport. So we concluded, even though we were in favour actually of expanding Heathrow in the end, because we thought from an economic point of view it was important, but we did believe that you should keep this constraint on flying, because otherwise you had an unlevel playing field. So I think this is an absolutely terrible idea and very bad timing. And the message to COP26 is terrible. But I have to say, just going right back to the thing Bridget said to start with, her first thing she said was, he ought to have cut tax on energy in the budget. That would have been even worse, because that would have been an absolutely terrible message to say that we are making energy so much cheaper so that people will use more of it. So this is a bad idea, that was a bad idea, and I really do think it's a shame that we've gone backwards on it, because it's the one area of taxation where we've got a rational, environmentally friendly tax system in place, and we're now dismantling it. Mistake.
I mean, I know for sure that not many people in the community that I represent in Sunderland get on regular short-haul domestic flights. What I do know also is that very few of them ever even go to work on a train, because we don't have any that run through my community.
Say that your idea on energy was a terrible idea?
Yeah, I will come to that. We don't have any trains either, and I think one of the immediate ways that we could actually make a real shift, and it's not hard for the government to do, would be to give greater power and control to local communities over bus services. I mean, that's often one of the biggest ways that people will go about their lives, will get to work, it will open up a lot more in the economy. On Howard's point around energy bills, you know, we've also set out a very ambitious programme around the transition that we need to see in the economy. But given the pressures that families are facing right now, we do think it's right that there is short-term help for 6 months to get families through what's likely to be a very tough winter. But of course, in the long run, we want to see the government doing a lot more to support people to have more energy efficient homes, to make that change that we need to see, and to use that to seize that opportunity to create really great jobs in every part of our country. So there is that opportunity. And to the point that the gentleman in the audience just made around, is there any point in doing this if others don't follow? I think this is a great opportunity for our country. I think we should seize this opportunity, show the way and show how things can be done, get our economy going, create lots of jobs and tackle that moral imperative around climate change too.
But Bridget, how long does this help go on? The whole country has been helped for the last 18 months with furlough, with support loans, with £20 a week that was temporary. Temporary means it needs to end. So now there is an increase in wage, there's jobs up the yin-yang that people can get, so they can earn money in different ways, and the £20 was always temporary, and people forget that has to come to an end. And no one likes it when it comes to an end, and now here's some alternative measures.
I think that's a very... I think that's a difficult argument to make to people who during the pandemic started to receive universal credit because of the circumstances around it. So all they've ever known has been that increase. And the government have had to recognise during the pandemic that the level at which universal credit was initially set wasn't adequate for families to get by. Now, of course, I think it was right that the government stepped in when they said to people you have to stay at home and when they closed businesses that support was provided. But I think what was missing from the budget was that longer-term plan about how we grow our economy, how we get things moving. Of course, COVID has presented challenges, but we've got lots of big challenges. We've had terrible growth for 10 years. Our public services are stripped to the bone. So this hasn't all arisen during the pandemic.
So we are talking about air passenger duty. You've had your hand up strenuously up at the back there, yes.
I'd like to know how many people in this room actually regularly take domestic flights. Who exactly is this benefiting? It's benefiting rich people. Reduced train fares, better bus services, that's what's going to help the average person, not less tax on domestic flights. Come on.
Man over the glass.
I think to get back on track, the question that was asked, and Fiona tried to reiterate that to you, is what message were you putting out? And what you were putting out is it is okay to travel by plane when plane is one of the biggest commuters. On the back of that...
Biggest polluters, I think.
Polluters, yes. Absolutely. At the end of the day, again, as one of the panel members said, climate was not even mentioned. What message is that putting out to people now and to young people in light of the fact that we are hosting a global thing around climate? And I'm still waiting for the answer.
Lucy, last chance.
I recognise the point people are making about climate change, and we are taking a lot of measures in relation to climate change, which I'm happy to talk about, but Fiona stopped me earlier. But
no, in fairness, I just tried to get... Don't give me that, Lucy. I just tried to get you to answer the question. Come on.
On this point, the message that we're trying to get out is a different one, which is about connectivity. It's about the point that Bridget made about people being able to move around through a train to get to places, get to work. There are some places, I was in a debate in the House of Commons today, and someone said there are places that you cannot get to by train in some of the, in Scotland, in Ireland, and many MPs were very pleased with this measure because they travel by plane to get to London for work. So what we're trying to do is ensure that we can get people moving, that we can get businesses connected to people, and this is a measure that increases infrastructure. And on Bridget's point about infrastructure, we are significantly spending money on infrastructure, £100 billion on infrastructure, to ensure that we can all get to work, that we can work well, and that we can move people to businesses.
Okay, let's take another question, which is from Joan Forster.
Since the fishing boat has been seized and another fined, is the end of our special relationship with France in sight?
Yes, it's all been very dramatic, hasn't it? So a British trawler has been seized by France. It's currently in harbour at Le Havre. The French are saying it was not allowed to fish in French waters. The British boat is saying, yes, it was. And another has been fined for not complying with the checks. Howard?
Yes, this special relationship is a very peculiar one. It's like the special relationship my dog has with squirrels in the garden. They just, they get on each other's wick. And I'm afraid we and the French do that, and we have done through time. Meaning the sensible approach that the governments take is to sort of spot that that's a bit of a joke, you know, it's cats and dogs, and solve problems by collaboration. And that was happening within the European Union, not so much now, it would seem. At the moment, you've got President Macron, who is standing for re-election next May, and the position is pretty complicated, frankly, with his main threatening challengers on the right, and of a sort of nationalistic, you know, flavour, if you like, on the right. So he's looking that way because that's where the threats to his votes come. So we've got that, and we've got also government here, which, you know, doesn't really want to talk about the damages being done by Brexit and would rather talk about this kind of thing, which is, you know, a bit of sort of hands up who's in favour of the French, seizing our fishing boats. Well, obviously, so nobody's going to put their hands up for that. Actually, you've got your hand up. Are you in favour of that? Oh, for a question. Okay, so
hang on.
I thought you were in favour of the French Navy. But so, I mean, honestly, what the reality of this particular issue is very hard to know. The French say they've applied for licences and they filled in the forms, and the British say you haven't filled in the forms properly. Who knows? But it's a symptom of a declining relationship at the moment, which I think is a shame.
And Jenny, the ante has been up considerably because France is threatening a number of things, preventing British boats from offloading their fish, doing a kind of go slow on checks on UK goods entering France, and also threatening to look at the energy supply from France to the UK. The UK government has now summoned the French ambassador.
So, we've always had a special relationship with France. In all my life, we've had a special relationship with France.
I can't remember them ever, in all my life, threatening to do this.
Well, no, but in all our life, we haven't been post-Brexit, have we? So there would always, post-Brexit, there's always going to be impacts. And when lines are drawn, there's always going to be chest beating either side of that line. And that's what this is. It's chest beating, and it's, my side and your side.
So what do you think should happen? What do you think should happen?
There needs to be a clear line of where you're able to fish and where you're not able to fish. It's just the same as if you go into the congestion zone or you don't go in the congestion zone, and if you're over the line, you get fined.
So you think the deal isn't clear then? Is that the problem?
I'm assuming due to all the discussion that's going on that some things are unclear, but are we really surprised?
Are you surprised? And man, there with your hand up.
No, I'm not surprised, and I'm certainly not putting my hand up for trawlers being impounded by the French. But to go back to Brexit, and one of the main thrusts, was to take control of our fishing industry. And yet, here we are, hitting these blocks right at the beginning. But I agree with what Jenny said. Are we really surprised? It's the French, after all.
Lucy?
It's obviously really important that we have a good relationship with one of our closest neighbours and allies. This issue is really disappointing and unfortunate because of the people the fishermen who've applied for licences, 98% of them have been given them. And what this is a question about is evidence. So apparently it's very difficult for a small boat to evidence that it has been fishing in British waters.
The French are saying it's less than 98% for what it's
Well, they may be saying that, but it's 98%.
It's only because they're not here, so I'm just putting their point because they're not here.
And so, we have said, the government has said, we're very happy to give the licences to the very few remaining people who have not got their licences, but we need to have some evidence to show that you meet the criteria, and please show us the evidence, and when you show us the evidence, we will, of course, grant the licences.
So where do you think this is going to end, then?
I think this will end...
The French have given us a deadline of Monday.
Well, I'm always an optimist, and I always thought we'd get a deal at the 11th hour in Brexit, and we did, so I'm always an optimist that things work out well in the end.
Miatta, are you feeling optimistic?
I'm not, and the thing that worries me is the sort of rising tension. I don't think we want to be in a position where we have potentially a sort of tit-for-tat trade war with our closest neighbour. 40% of the trade from the UK was going into the EU. We cannot afford to mess up that relationship. And I think for me, at the end of the day, this goes back to the fact that the Prime Minister told us Brexit was done. He told us he did a deal. And what we're now seeing is actually it wasn't done. And that deal is unravelling.
And they did also say there'll be bumps along the road.
Well, these are quite big bumps. These are quite big
Waves,
bumps.
perhaps.
And why it matters to me is that we were told that Brexit would happen and our lives would be better. The economy would be better, we'd see sunny uplands, our lives would be better. And, the OBR speaks for itself. The economy is going to be 4% smaller as a consequence of this. And I say to the Prime Minister, this is your problem. He needs to go back and he needs to fix this because he promised us he would, and Brexit was not done, and he needs to go and fix it and get it done.
Man here in the striker shirt.
Yeah, I think this is just a continuation of the attitude of EU and France and all those countries towards the UK since the time of Brexit. Brexit is done, we've moved on, and we just need to carry on. But the EU and France and all the other nations still seem to have this point and try to target the UK every single time. I mean, these are poor fishermen trawling in the English Channel, and what's the need to detain them over this matter? It needs to be discussed with the government at the higher level and not targeting these poor fishermen. And it just goes to show their attitude and not coming to the negotiating table and trying to reach the middle ground or level playing ground, as they say it. And we have seen again in the news this week, I think it was, that they're now targeting Poland, and they've got into trouble with the EU and again causing all these problems. It only goes to show their attitude, I feel.
Bridget?
I think it's right that the British government does discuss this with the French ambassador. I think, we don't want to see tensions escalating. I would hope that the government would try and get a swift resolution on this, that they could sit down, talk about it, find a way through it. I think the last thing that we want is kind of further tensions or an escalation there. So I just hope that they can sit down and sort this out as quickly as possible.
And so when we hear people saying it's not surprising it's the French, is that your view? Or it's not surprising because the EU, this is the EU wanting to kind of punish Britain, I think is what you're saying for
no, I don't think that. And I mean, my priority is always kind of what's within our power and our control. So I hold our government to a high standard in what we should be seeking to do right now. I would just like them to try and find a way through it, to resolve it, to try and reduce these tensions. But I think on the wider question about Brexit, I think a lot of the frustration that people will often have is that it feels a lot of the time, and from what Lucy said tonight, that the government doesn't really have a plan to make Brexit work. It's happened, it's done, but where's the plan to make it work?
Did you say you don't have a plan to make it work?
I think I said the complete opposite of that. So we have a big plan. We have negotiations ongoing, as I said, with a number of countries outside of Europe to ensure that we can get those trade deals, enabling us to trade more profitably and productively. We're also reviewing all our laws to see what we can do that we could not do before. And we've already amended a few of them, 3 of them in the budget, to enable us to be more competitive. We've also looked at, for example, immigration, how we can get high-skilled workers from other countries to make our country more innovative and competitive. So we have a number of measures to take advantage of the opportunity that Brexit presented.
One thing that was often said back in the referendum campaign was that outside of the EU we would have the power to cut VAT. So the Chancellor in this budget we've just had could have cut VAT on gas and electricity bills with that power that he's got available to him, and yet he didn't do that.
So can I answer that? Because Bridget, you've said it 3 times, and the reason that we didn't cut VAT in relation to fuel was because if we had done so, it would have applied across the board. That means that very wealthy people would be getting a VAT cut when they absolutely didn't need it.
But very wealthy people are getting a tax break.
So it wasn't an effective measure. What we have done for people on low incomes is targeted measures to ensure that we can support the people who need it, not giving tax breaks to people who don't need it. You've hammered them with
the biggest tax burden since the 1950s.
All right, let's hear for a couple from the audience. Yes, the man there, yes, in the jacket, yeah. You, sir.
You talk about profitable trade deals. It's been reported by your own government that the trade deal with New Zealand will contribute 0 in terms of GDP. Are these the types of trade deals that we're going to see in the future from our government?
What do you make of what you've heard?
How does doing trade deals with New Zealand and Australia, for example, how does that help the climate?
All right, and let's just hear one more comment here from the man in the red sweater.
The trade deals that are there at the moment and shipping stuff across the world. A few years ago, before the pandemic, a container was £2,000 or £3,000. It's now £40,000 or £50,000 for that container. So all that money has got to be put onto that goods which are inside that container. So that's why everything's going up, but nobody's talking about that.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move on, not because I don't want to talk about it, but I've got a number of questions to get to, so I'll just take another one from Ian Whelan.
Thanks, Fiona. Given that this week the House of Commons made it mandatory for everyone to wear a face covering, apart from the MPs. Doesn't that add to the mixed messaging that's blighted the pandemic and also add to the narrative of the us and them?
Jenny?
I must admit I was also bemused by the headline and felt exactly the same as you did. So again, it made me dig beneath it and say, how can that be? That doesn't sound right. And then there was a comment from a certain MP about, well, we all know each other, which wasn't a very helpful comment either.
Oh, this was Jacob Rees-Mogg saying,
yes,
saying there's
Great.
a convivial, fraternal spirit between Conservatives.
So we all know each other and we know where you've been and are you double jabbed and all that sort of thing. So the headline didn't make sense to me either. All I could say is when I got behind the headline, which you always have to do, it was about the House of Commons and people who are employed there, that they were able to give, management team were able to give directive to those people there that they needed to put more measures in place. But because the MPs are not part of that building, if you like, in an employment, then they weren't able to instruct them. But it came out really badly and it looked like them and us. And you know what? Common sense needs to prevail. And where you're in busy environments like that, then, you know, your mask should be on.
Lucy, I couldn't help but notice during the budget yesterday there was an embarrassment almost of masks. There were so many masks on the government benches, not Jacob Rees-Mogg, I hasten to add. And looking at the House of Commons today, far fewer.
Well, Jenny's point is right, that it's about workplace and the rules are different in relation to, and the people who make the decisions are different in relation to the staff and in relation to members.
So given what we saw yesterday, are you all going to be wearing masks now?
So coming to your point, it's voluntary for MPs, but what I'm seeing is what you noticed, Fiona.
Well, I noticed it yesterday. I didn't notice it today.
Well, I noticed, I sat through the whole debate today and I was wearing a mask and a large number of my colleagues were wearing a mask, and you'll have seen during PMQs yesterday, the Prime Minister was wearing a mask throughout the budget. So, you know, I think the rules at the moment are not mandatory in a variety of, well, in almost all places from a national perspective, and people are making their own decisions, but I think we are seeing an increasing number of MPs wearing masks.
Yes, the woman there in the blue top and the glasses, yes.
I think it's quite interesting how countries in Europe where there's mask wearing is mandatory and they also have vaccine passports have at the moment a much, much lower incidence of COVID than they do in the UK.
Okay. And the man here in the pink shirt.
I think that's the bottom line. We missed a trick. We got 15 months getting used to wearing masks in public places. Why didn't we just carry on doing that and make it mandatory?
Okay. So Ian's question is this mixed messaging that staff in the House of Commons have to wear masks and MPs don't?
Yes, I think it is. It does send a mixed message, and I think it makes it look like somehow there's one rule for MPs and one rule for everybody else, and I think that's just completely wrong. I mean, it just seems like basic common sense to me that if you're in a very crowded House of Commons chamber, as we were during the budget, where there's hundreds of people packed in for a prolonged period of time, that you wear a mask. I think it just is straightforward
and not at the Labour
common
Party
sense.
conference, where you're packed in there? Not mask wearing going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we all had to provide a negative test and the vaccine COVID pass. I was frequently wearing a mask during Labour Party conference as well, I have to say. I always wear a mask in the House of Commons chamber. I do when I move around. I think you look at the rising infection rates that we see, and if we can do something like wearing masks, keeping that rate of infection down, then I think it's far better to do that than end up in a position where we need more stringent measures. I think that's the last thing any of us would want.
Man there in the glasses.
I think it was really, really poor form from Jacob Rees-Mogg 6 or 7 days ago too. He's not just any MP. He's the leader of the Commons. He's high profile. He was dealing with the whole issue flippantly, in a jocular fashion, making, as usual, jokes. And I just think it was really poor form and giving a really poor message that's leading to confusion out with the general public.
Yes, it's a strange anomaly, isn't it, that male MPs have to wear a jacket and tie in the House of Commons. Otherwise, they're not allowed to ask a question. But they don't have to wear a mask. Or just a jacket, actually. They can get away with that tie.
So, look, I think it's really confusing messaging. I struggle to understand why we aren't making masks mandatory. You know, other European countries do it. And, you know, the thing that sort of strikes me is that there's a level of complacency there. And quite frankly, when the government has an absolutely atrocious record on the pandemic, one of the highest death rates, COVID death rates in Europe, at the moment, our infectious rates are the highest in Europe. We've got about 8,500 COVID patients in hospital. The test and trace system that, a committee of MPs said was an absolute catastrophic disaster, and we wasted £37 billion on it. I would have thought there'd be more humility. I would have thought the government would have learnt some lessons, and I think the government should be taking a far more preventative approach to this rather than kind of hoping for the best. So I just don't understand it, and it feels to me that there were lessons that needed to be learned over the course of the pandemic that still haven't been learned.
And Howard, it's worth pointing out that infection rates, having been so high, are beginning to go down now, and the modelling suggests it will go down. For how long, we can't say.
Yeah, they do seem to be going down very slightly. The difficulty about all these infection rates and the international comparisons is that, you have more infection rates, you have more people tested, and we tend to test rather more people at the moment. So you can't be sure quite what you're comparing. But on the specific question, I've got a lot of sympathy actually for the government on this, because it's been a very confusing period, and keeping your messaging straight is difficult. But I've got to say, I just love the rules. And you mentioned about France and other places. It's so simple. You go into a restaurant, a bar, you show your thing. You go into a tube, you put your mask on. In the French metro, the compliance is about 98%, would be my view. And I go to the office on the tube in London, and the compliance is now about 60%. Well, you get 60% compliance, you might as well not have it at all. So, because it's hopeless. So I think we have missed a trick, as Miatta said, in not deciding we're just going to go for some simple rules. People don't have to think about it. It's hardly an attack on civil liberties, frankly. And so I think it's a mistake. And this particular point to which you refer is just a symptom of a broader inability to decide what we really want to do.
We've just got time to get one more question in from Ellen McFarlane. Where are you? Aleva.
Should water companies be forced to reduce the amount of sewage discharges into rivers and the sea, given the billions of pounds of profit they've made in recent years?
Lucy.
Well, I think you're referring to the debate that's going through the House at the moment. And the government is acting on that and is asking water companies, is proposing an amendment to the legislation that's going through to require water companies to get their sewage rates down. The reason the government didn't accept the amendment that went through the House of Lords is just the vast cost of what was being proposed, which ran into billions of pounds.
Bridget?
I'm just flabbergasted that the government didn't support what seemed to me like a pretty straightforward measure to try and really clean up our seas and rivers. I think during the pandemic, in particular, lots of people have, I think, really come to recognise the importance that we place on the environment that's around us and how important kind of open spaces, clean air and our seas and rivers are. So I think it is really important that we take action. We've got a terrible record as a country. Over the last decade, the quality of the water has got considerably worse. I don't think that's right. I think we need to take much more action to make sure that, when children are going to go and splash in streams or be at the coast, that they can do so safely in the knowledge that it's the right, it's right and the safety and that the water quality is good.
It's interesting you say that, because the Environment Agency Chief of Staff, John Leonard, is in a documentary tonight saying that rivers are not there for human swimming.
Well, I think...
What do you make of that?
I think lots of people do enjoy for swimming, but I think even if you set aside swimming, I think, I know with my own children, I'm sure lots of other kids are the same. Like, they love going and splashing at the sea on the coastline. In my part of the world, we're not far from the coast, and in rivers and streams. And I think that's a really important part of children's childhoods and opportunity. And we should be making that easier. We should be giving families access to good open spaces so that we can get outside, enjoy that amazing countryside and rivers and sea that we have all around us. But that does mean that we need to see action from the government to do that.
I saw this story as well this week, and it shouldn't take a public outcry to say this is not right, but seemingly it does. So, I saw the picture like everybody else did of you know, this raw sewage spewing out somewhere.
This was into, in fact, I was doing the news that night, it was into Langstone Harbour, which is a conservation area in Hampshire. And what you saw, I don't know how maybe you saw it, but you saw this long pipe going out, pumping out sewage for 49 hours straight. And of course, what the water companies say is, you know, when there's heavy rainfall, particularly, they have to do that to stop it backing up, you know, into our homes.
So I read into that then, because initially I thought there's a major incident, this is a mistake. And then when I read into it, I realised that the water companies, when are allowed, licensed to, when there is a deluge of water and to prevent the drains backing up into your houses, they're allowed to release some into places like that. But then doesn't that allow the water companies not to improve their water systems so that doesn't happen and they don't have to do that? So you're almost incentivising them to do nothing about their water systems so that they can just put it in the water and in your rivers. But I appreciate it will cost a lot of money to revamp all our water systems, and then where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from the taxpayer. So we kind of go around that circle again.
Class.
Yeah, doesn't that gloss over the elephant in the room that we've got a huge Victorian infrastructure that's going to need replacing? Someone's got to pay for it. Even in our area here, the drains go consistently on a regular basis because they're old and they can't cope with the pressure. So I think we need to address that as a financial issue as well with the water companies, because someone's got to pay for it.
Howard?
Yeah, I think there is a climate change dimension to this, because these incidents of flooding and very heavy rainfall are becoming more frequent. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why this has become more prominent. I don't think we can carry on with the system that we've currently got, but I do have some sympathy with the government faced with this particular amendment, because I do think if we're going to change the rule, there's going to have to be quite a period of investment, because otherwise, you know, you will have some rather peculiar consequences. If you know, the sewage has got to go somewhere and it'll come backwards if it doesn't go forward. So you've got to give the companies time to invest in a better system than they can.
But you need to incentivise them to invest, not incentivise them to chuck it out there.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so I was really shocked to hear that 400,000 times a year sewage is dumped into our rivers and seas. I think
yes, that was last year in England.
Yeah, absolutely shocking. And, you know, I think for me, the fact that it was even in doubt that we would put a duty on the companies, I find quite incredible. I don't think it sends a particularly strong signal about the government's commitment to the environment. But, you know, I think the question I come back to is how on earth have we got ourselves into this position where we have water companies that, you know, bills have gone up, they've made quite a lot of profit, they have underinvested in the infrastructure, there has been quite a lot of asset stripping, so getting debt that hasn't gone into investing in that infrastructure, and we're now in this bind. And, you know, quite frankly, where I come from is for something as essential and fundamental as our water, quite frankly, that we are all reliant on, I think it should be owned by us. I think it should be in public hands so that the water system works for the public and in our interest. Because I think the system that we have is broken, and the reason why there's this massive bill that, by the way, someone will have to pay for is because the water system hasn't been taken care of anymore, and we've got to bring an end to it.
Ellen, you asked a question. What's your view?
Well, I was just going to say exactly what Miatta said. If the water, something as precious as water was nationalised, then we wouldn't be in this issue. Jenny said that the taxpayer should potentially have to pay for the investment that needs to go into the Victorian infrastructure. But why should we have to pay when the water companies are making billions of pounds of profit for decades?
All right. Our hour is up, I'm afraid. We will stop talking about that. Thank you very much to the panel for coming along this evening. Thank you to the audience here in Stockport. Very good to hear your views. And thank you, of course, to you at home for watching. From Question Time in Stockport. Bye-bye.